Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Also leave a comment, good, bad or indifferent. Thanks for watching. In June 1969, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards and Charlie Watts arrived at Cotchford Farm, the previous home of A.A. Milne and the current home of Brian Jones. Brian came downstairs, opened the door and invited them in while his girlfriend Anna Woland stayed in bed. Downstairs she heard the group arguing, then shouting. The decision had been made to fire Brian from the group.
And so Mick and I had to go down and sort of tell Brian virtually, like, hey, you're fired.
They just didn't see eye to eye anymore, and Brian's convictions meant he couldn't join them for their North American tour anyway. The incident wasn't too much of a shock to Brian. He'd wanted to leave the band since 1964. He'd lost control of the group, and the musical direction Mick and Keith were going in depressed Brian greatly. 15 minutes after the Stones had left to drive back to London, albeit one member less, Brian was snorting cocaine off a table. Whether Keith gave it to him, or whether the stories are true that Brian would hide drugs in books throughout the house, we don't know. By the evening, Brian was flying around the house manically, and by the night time he was throwing up in the bathroom toilet. Anna recalled being terrified that if he went to sleep he would not wake up again, so she kept him awake throughout the night until she felt the drug had worn off. Just a few weeks later, Brian would drown in his swimming pool while Anna was having a conversation on the phone with her friend from London. Lewis Brian Hopkins Jones was born 28th of February 1942 in Cheltenham, England. Both of his parents were musicians, with both playing piano and his father giving piano lessons. Brian cared deeply about what his parents thought of him, but they seldom showed him any affection. His father was a domineering man who never used the word love. His mother was a strict woman who once burst into tears when she heard him playing a jazz record. Jazz, his mother felt, was depraved. Years later, Pat Andrews, a girlfriend of Brian's, stated, "He was very jealous and insecure. I couldn't figure out why he was like that until I met his parents." Brian attended private school where he excelled at English, French and maths. He enjoyed playing cricket, but as a friend recalled, he was extremely asthmatic. He didn't have the stamina to play a full match. Encouraged by his parents, he began playing cricket, but soon a rift developed over Brian's taste in music. He played records obsessively and copied the riffs on guitar until they matched perfectly. When he began playing guitar for the first time in school, a friend later stated, "My impression was that he was a loner." In 1960, at age 17, Brian's parents kicked him out of the house. His girlfriend at the time later described it as a really sad night. A year later, Brian began playing slide guitar with a brass tube he found in a Cheltenham junkyard. He began playing slide guitar in pubs and clubs, and in 1962, this is where he met Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Mick and Keith felt both intimidated and impressed upon watching him play live. When the band formed, Brian taught Keith the art of guitar's weaving, a practice in which two guitarists switched between rhythm and lead. Keith's now legendary style of playing in open G tuning was learned by watching Brian. In Keith's biography Life, he stated that using open G tuning transformed my life. Mary Ann Faithfull later stated, Brian's death left Keith free to become Brian. Brian named his new band the Rolling Stones, a name inspired by the Muddy Waters song Rolling Stone. The band focused on playing blues and jazz cover songs. Cream drummer Ginger Baker recognised the band's take on these blues covers was something radical and new. He stated, "I like Brian. He was cool, the real musician in the Stones." Brian was very vulnerable, friends recalled. he was prone to mood swings and outright despair. Dick Hatterall recalled he remembered Brian as being very lonely and down in the early days of the group. Keith, he said in contrast, was less bothered about setbacks. After all, he had his mom who would turn up to bring food round and collect his washing. Unlike Brian, Mick and Keith had a comfortable family life. Unlike Brian, Mick's dad supported his son's musical aspirations. The three shared a flat together and endured many cold nights going hungry. A friend later recalled, the guys were literally starving to death. The band's early performances were rocky. One time the audience booed them off stage and Brian was really upset. Mick and Keith not so much. Brian was definitely the most sensitive of the Stones. Ginger Baker later recalled, Brian was doing all the showmanship. Jagger was just standing there and singing. I was watching it with Jack. We weren't terribly impressed with the music, but it was so raw there was obviously something about it that would take off. There was no denying Brian was a difficult person. He would change his mind at the drop of a hat, was completely unreliable, and his mood swings affected those around him. A friend recalled, he could be the sweetest person ever, then just like that, click of the fingers, he'd lose his temper completely and be the most horrible person you could ever be with. Brian would then apologise, and as always he'd be forgiven and everything would be forgotten about. In these early days, Keith was in awe of Brian and Mick felt left out. At the time, Mick's singing wasn't blowing anyone away. Some stated, without a microphone, Mick was dreadful. Mick always liked Brian, but his respect was mixed with rivalry. The Stones' first single, Come On, reached number 38, and the band made their first appearance on Ready Steady Cook on August 23rd, 1963. During this time, Mick was still attending the London School of Economics. He would not enrol for the next term in September. Their next single came from their supposed rivals, the Beatles. I Want to Be Your Man was described as a throwaway song by John Lennon. He also added, we weren't going to give them anything great, right? Nevertheless, Mick's snarling vocals gave the song another dimension. It also attracted a lot of press attention. The first step in Brian's downfall began when he demanded that he be paid £5 more than the rest of the group. His demands were met, but a resentment from Mick and Keith now began. Brian saw the band's first album as his baby. He wanted the Stones' live sound to translate over to record, so he worked on it obsessively. He even re-recorded some of Keith's lead guitar without his knowledge. He stated, I think it's good, I hope it's good enough. The album was a success with glowing reviews. Brian was ecstatic, but the inner squabbles in the band seemed to affect him more than Mick and Keith. From this point, Brian's position of leader began to slip away from him. His obsessive nature caused friction. A friend later recalled, with Brian it was never good enough, because it wasn't perfect. He'd find fault all the way through. By 1965, on the insistence of the band's manager Andrew Oldham, Mick and Keith began writing their own music. Brian began writing his own songs, but his inability to finish a song and disinterest from the rest of the band meant nothing ever came of them. Brian's drinking had steadily increased over the past 2 years. His friend Dave Thompson remembered Brian drinking a bottle of whiskey in an hour or two. The release of I Can't Get No Satisfaction marked a further detachment from Brian and the Stones. Keith's fuzzy, distorted guitar sound had critics hailing him as sonic innovator. With endless practice, Keith had overtaken Brian as a guitarist. The success of I Can't Get No Satisfaction brought the success Brian had dreamed of, with the cost of losing leadership of the band. When Brian took LSD for the first time that year, Bill Wyman recalled, he was walking along Sunset Boulevard and jumping along the pavement trying to avoid snakes. Brian began a relationship with a German model named Anita Pallenberg. They become deeply obsessed with each other, even cutting their hair the same and wearing similar clothes, in order to look like each other. For now, Brian's thoughts of leaving the Rolling Stones disintegrated. During the recording of Aftermath, Brian experimented with new sounds using instruments like the dulcimer, sitar, marimba and Japanese koto. Brian transformed the one-dimensional tracks using these instruments and wrote the entire melody to paint it black. Though to Keith and Oldham's recollections, he was zonked out during this period. Mick and Keith's songwriting partnership was never really a collaborative effort. The Jagger-Richards partnership was just a brand used to sound like Lennon and McCartney. The truth is, Mick or Keith would write songs individually that they'd bring to the table, and depending on who wrote what is all down to whose story you believe. By 1967, the psychedelic era, along with psychedelic rock, was in full swing. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had changed the direction of music and fashion, and the Stones felt pressured to change with the times. That same year, Brian, Mick and Keith were arrested for drug possession. The three were given jail sentences but served very little time. From a 9-month sentence, Brian served a total of 1 day. Around this time, Brian's girlfriend Anita Pallenberg had left him for Keith. His father believes it was losing Anita to Keith that was the turning point in Brian's life.
So you were at Keith's? Yeah, that's right. He was travelling with that girlfriend of his. Anita.
Brian never forgave Keith. Regarding their friendship, Keith later said it was the final nail in the coffin and that he didn't blame him. By mid-1967, Brian had begun taking the powerful Downer Mandrax, also known as Quaaludes. They did two things for Brian: bloated out reality and helped him sleep. A friend recalled, "It was horrible when Brian started taking downers. He was a completely changed person." Brian's fascination with the occult rubbed off on the rest of the band. This was none more evident than in the track Sympathy for the Devil. He'd always had some interest in the devil ever since he'd read about how blues legend Robert Johnson sold his soul in order to become a great songwriter. Their next album, Beggar's Banquet, featured little involvement from Brian. Mick and Keith were so far removed from Brian at this point, it was as if he wasn't part of the band. He can be heard playing sitar on Street Fighting Man and slide guitar on No Expectations. The slide guitar, slow and understated, gave the feeling of a beaten man. In November 1968, Brian Jones purchased Cotchford Farm in West Sussex. The house was formerly owned by Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne, and statues of Christopher Robin gazed upon Brian as he walked the grounds. By this point in his life, Brian was, in Keith Richards' words, in bye-bye land. He drank excessively. A friend recalled, "Brian didn't look too well. He had a habit of a few bottles of wine a day." Brian had lost interest in playing guitar at this point and rarely picked it up. Tom Keelock, an associate of the Stones, was asked to keep an eye on Brian. He had previously worked for Keith, but after charging furniture to Keith's bank account, he was fired. He was a lowlife, others recalled. By 1969, Brian was living in Cotchford Farm with his new Swedish girlfriend Anna Wolan. He needed some work done on the house, and Tom Keelock recommended a builder named Frank Thorogood.
I want some lights from the pool and some beams in the kitchen so it matches the rest of the house.
Thorogood did shoddy work on the house. He once fitted a beam in Brian's dining room which collapsed and almost hit Anna. He employed a team of builders to work with him, and once Anna caught them stealing food from their pantry. Thorogood was living in a flat above Brian's garage, and each evening he joined Brian and Anna for dinner. They drank wine together, most likely Blue Nun as it was Brian's favourite. Then Brian would move on to brandy and Frank would switch to vodka. Most nights the three would end up in the pool after their meal. The days before Brian's death, Anna had complained of the pool being too cold, so Brian raised the thermostat to 90 degrees. There are discrepancies about what happened the day Brian died, but I've taken each account and put together what I think is the most accurate. Brian wakes up at 11 AM, then watches the tennis from Wimbledon on TV for most of the afternoon. He ate a salad for lunch, snacked on food during the day, and later that evening sent Frank out to buy alcohol for that night. That day, Brian, Anna, Frank and a nurse named Janet Lawson, who was also Tom Keelock's girlfriend, were all staying at the house. The group ate hash cakes and drank alcohol. The Stones manager later recalled Brian was out of his mind that night. Word got out that there was a big party at Brian's house that night, and for years afterwards, hundreds of people have claimed to have been invited. But in reality, there was no party, just a small group of 4. At around 10:15 PM, Brian decided to go for a swim. He loaded up a tray with drinks and changed into his multicoloured swimming trunks. Brian, Frank and Anna went out for their usual swim, albeit a bit later than normal. Janet felt Brian and Frank were in no condition to swim and mentioned it to both men before heading up to the music room and playing guitar. Anna left the pool and returned to the house to answer a phone call. Not long after, Frank headed back to the house to get a cigarette or to find a towel, depending on whose story you believe. Janet headed out to the pool and immediately saw Brian face down at the bottom. She shouted, "Something has happened to Brian." Anna dove into the pool and pulled Brian out. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was attempted, and Anna noticed that Brian still had a pulse. By the time the medics arrived, Brian was pronounced dead.
Thorogood returned to the farm with former Rolling Stones road manager Tom Keelock.
He was in the bottom, down there, right down the bottom. Yeah, I called out to Anna. She dived in. By that time, I'd lifted him up.
In later years, Janet Lawson and Anna Wolin would accuse Frank of holding Brian's head under the water, despite neither of them actually seeing this. Tom Keelock would claim Frank confessed on his deathbed to murdering Brian.
I went to see Frank in the hospital. He was very seriously ill. He looked very, very bad. And after a lengthy conversation, he said to me, "Tom, there's something I've got to tell you," he said. "I've got to put my house in order." And I thought, "House in order? What's that?" He said, "I'll tell you something after all these years, but you must promise me not to say anything until I die." I said, "Well, what's that?" So he turned around and says, "It was me that done Brian."
The claims were dismissed by Frank Thorogood's daughter Jan Bell. She stated that her father never mentioned anything about this to her, and Tom Keelock never spent any time alone with her father. She went on to say Frank was admitted to hospital with a respiratory problem and was therefore not aware he was on his deathbed, so he couldn't have made a deathbed confession. Later, Keelock's story would change and he'd claim Frank never said that and then change back again. Keelock also claimed he was there the night Brian died, which goes against the word of the 3 other people we know were at the house that night. He was also verified to have been at Olympic Studios on the night in question. In 2003, a bar owner brought 2 gold records for Paint It Black and Little Red Rooster. The memorabilia was previously owned by Brian but had disappeared after his death. The owner had bought the items from Tom Keelock, confirming he had stolen these items back in 1969. Paintings, clothes, and some of Brian's guitars have also never been traced. The apparent motive for Brian's murder was the money Brian owed Frank, despite the fact that Brian paid Thorogood $18,000 for work on Cotchford Farm. That's the equivalent of $290,000 today. After the event, police quizzed Thorogood excessively, but no charges were made. In the years since Brian Jones' death, it seems everyone would cash in on the conspiracy of Brian Jones' murder. Many books were written on the subject, each full of unsupported evidence, hearsay and rumours. In Nicholas Fitzgerald's book, The Inside Story of the Original Rolling Stone, he claims that he was witness to 3 men drowning Brian in the pool while a man and 2 women watched on. He then claims Tom Keelock jumped out of the bushes and told him, "Get out of here or you'll be next." A.E. Hotchner's 1990 book, Blown Away, The Rolling Stones and The Death of the 60s claimed Dick Hatterall was at Cotchford Farm from around the time of Brian's death and confirms the story from Fitzgerald's book. Hatterall has since rebutted his story and says it's all nonsense and that he never visited Cotchford Farm. Jeffrey Giuliano's 1994 book Paint It Black recycled allegations from Dick Hatterall, who since denied any speculation to Brian's death. In 1999, Anna Walling's book The Murder of Brian Jones was published. In her book she claimed Brian and Frank argued over bills for work done on Cotchford Farm and the two fell out. Though she doesn't explain why Brian, who's supposedly angry at Frank, invited him for a swimming session. She didn't make any of these claims until 28 years after Brian's death and made no mention of this to the police at the time or any time when Frank was alive. The rest of her book recollects Brian being focused on his music and ready to start a new life with her. This was contradicted by many other sources. Anna seems to have been convinced by the previous conspiracy theories over time that Brian was murdered, which is odd because some of the speculations include two women at the pool watching the murder. One of the women would have presumably been her. Her friend, Jan Olofsson, stated at the time that they spoke and they both agreed that Brian drowned, but her story changed many years later. I never believed the notion Brian Jones was murdered. There are questions around what exactly happened on the night, but just like his dismissal from the band, Brian's death was self-inflicted.